and welcome to Race and Redemption Part 3. Before we get into this today, let me first make sure that everyone knows who's going to be communicating, who's part of our conversational panel today. We'll start over here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jaleith.
Tell us something about yourself, Jaleith.
I am a pescatarian.
A pescatarian. All right. Well, so just going straight for it. So appreciate that. And what else? Just refresh me. Besides,
What's relevant?
no,
Yeah.
maybe what do you do for work or
Sure.
connection to Calvary or
Sure. So I work at Urban Alliance, and we strengthen outreach programs at Christian churches and nonprofits in the greater Hartford area. And at Calvary, I am an assistant worship leader, and I sing and play the pads.
awesome. And over here,
Hi everybody, I'm Ryan Lindsay and I am also a pescatarian-ish,
Hey.
but I ate chicken over the weekend.
what's the ish? Yes.
Ish. I'm originally from BC and I've been here in Hartford since September of 2018.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Well, thank you. And so my name is Bill, lead pastor of Calvary Fellowship. I am a committed carnivore, but I also eat fish, so I feel like I'm pretty inclusive in my selections of eating and what I like to consume. But sorry for being stupid. That's just kind of how it goes sometimes. But let's get right into what we're doing here today. This is Race and Redemption Part 4. This is a series of conversations that we want to have as a church. We look at a lot of people that are upset and angry and that are either withdrawing from what could be good conversations or are frustrated, and so there's maybe a talking past at times or just not making a connection that they'd hope to have, and so we see that efforts aren't being as optimized as they might be. So what we're trying to do is just trying to take the space and have some important conversations about race, racism, justice, injustice, a lot of topics related and connected to these things, but also have it in a redemptive way where we look to, as followers of Jesus, and if you're not a follower of Jesus, we're glad you're here too, and we hope there's something helpful for you, but want to let you know the bent we're coming from and to say, how should we have these conversations? Because ultimately, God calls all of us to be united in Him, and that takes some work sometimes, this ministry of reconciliation that the Bible speaks of. So that's sort of the general purpose. But today's topic should be an interesting one. It could be a challenging one. But today's topic is Black Lives Matter. Now, before we get into that actual topic, I want to ask you guys, let's talk about what are some of the difficulties when talking about this topic, mentally, emotionally. What are some of the maybe not just the complexities of the topic, but what I mean is for people that may right now just might already kind of feel their blood boiling or rising, regardless of what ethnicity. What are some of those challenges that people are already going to kind of walk into this with?
Sure. I'll start. Okay. Well, I think one of the things that I've observed in having these kinds of conversations and that I've experienced even is just that it's very frustrating to just be trying to tell somebody that your life matters and that you're a human and that you should be treated fairly and the same as everybody else. And I think when having these kinds of conversations, the idea of like agreeing to disagree on whether or not Black Lives Matter isn't really a thing for Black people, generally speaking. But also just it's taxing personally. I've shared this with you guys before and with every one of you too in these live streams, just that advocating for your safety and for your dignity and for your right to life without qualification is just very exhausting work, and having conversations to explain something that you've explained so many times is also just very discouraging sometimes and taxing. So I think those are some of the things to balance. I know that some of my friends are just very frustrated and kind of fed up. I sometimes get to this point of like, I don't want to talk anymore. I just want change. But I recognize that, I've been able to kind of have a voice in certain spaces, and that's important to leverage. So I think those are some of the ways I can answer that question. If you guys can't hear, by the way, please let me know in the comments.
Yes, last week we mentioned that there were challenges with the audio and people being able to hear, thus me trying to project a little bit more today. But also, as you can see, there's 3 of us today, which I'm happy about. But if you have issues with the volume, please let us know. We'll do what we can to adjust that. But Ryan, same question, and I think Jaleith, thank you for that. You gave a great answer. But why is this maybe difficult, in maybe from your experience or people that you've talked to even begin having this conversation?
I think it's difficult, particularly for people in America, Americans, anyone who comes to call America home, because it is something that the nation has always struggled to reckon with and to address properly. I think when we really think about it, America is a country that treated millions of people, Black people, as property first. And so when that is the literal history of this nation, and it became a process of fighting for that freedom, the nation ripping apart into the Confederacy versus the Union, and eventually the rejoining of the nation, then there were still a number of hurdles, be it Jim Crow law or decades of lynching, all of these things that have happened within the fabric of American history that some people have chosen to acknowledge and some people have chosen to sort of look away from, and not understand how deeply racism and how deeply the enslavement of Black people has really affected the fabric of this country. And so I think that, and those are not conversations I think that we have enough as people, and I don't think it's necessarily adequately or accurately reflected in education in terms of what we're taught about slavery and what we're taught about racism, and how pervasive it is, and why, someone's school might look different in neighborhoods and things like that. And so I think because, unfortunately, at least in my opinion, the nation hasn't thoroughly and fully and made a commitment to reckoning about how damaging slavery was and how it continues to damage people, that makes it hard for people to talk about why it is that Black Lives Matter and why we even have to say that in the first place.
Well, and thank you for that. I appreciate that. You guys both gave some great answers. And for those, is there a way for us to pull in? I know we got some comments about that, or that's probably about as close as we're going to get on that.
I think this is probably the closest we can get on.
All right, we're just going to kind of keep trying to talk and loud enough and project enough to where you guys can hear, and I hope that you can. Well, I appreciate you guys both weighing in. So basically what we've said before, we've said a lot, is that we understand that this is a challenging conversation to have, but an important conversation to have. And for many people, it is one that you're just tired of. For some people, for various reasons, but we think it's important and we want to approach it fresh today. So having said that, let me ask, and whoever wants to weigh in of you here, despite, hey, in a sense, we're tired of it, yet there is still a real feeling that as an African American person, it's important to hear and have recognized from white people the specific phrase Black Lives Matter, whether it be from an individual, an organization, a church, or whatever, that's important to you. And would you first of all answer, is that true? Is that correct in what I asked and said? And if so, why is it important? Not just the sentiment, not just the idea and the affirmation, but specifically that phrase, why is that so important?
I think, so you and I had a long conversation about this, and I think because, in touching on sort of what I talked about a little bit earlier, is that, again, my people, my ancestors were brought here as property, and so not as people, not as a life. Like, we were used for labor. We were used to procreate so that labor force could be continued. And so that is the history of my people, or the beginning of the history of my people in this country. And I think that now, and we've had to fight for rights, we've had to fight for equality. And so I think when it comes to now we talked a lot about the difference sort of between the organization versus the affirmation. And for me, I think at its baseline, when Patrice Cullors and a couple other black women tweeted out hashtag Black Lives Matter a few years ago. It was an affirmation of the humanity of black people. And it wasn't about, at that point, they had not even formed the organization. It was just this affirmation. And so when you look around and you see so many black people who are being killed either by police or other citizens, and you see constantly that happening, then you start to question, does my life matter? Do Black Lives matter? And you see not only the murders that happen, but then also the amount of poverty that black communities experience, the number of black men and women and children even who are incarcerated. You see just so many disparities, health disparities. You know, unfortunately, I think black people are dying at a rate at least 2 times higher than other racial demographics when it comes to COVID-19. And so all of these things, you look around and it doesn't necessarily seem or feel like Black Lives Matter. And so when you're in a church that might not be predominantly, that might be diverse rather than predominantly white or predominantly black, or you're in a workspace that might be predominantly white, which a lot of workspaces tend to be, then sometimes on the day-to-day when you're already so hurt and impacted by this continual cycle of death, of black death, then just an affirmation like that to say, hey, I see you and your life matters and the life of other black people, whether or not you know them, matters. And I think that's important in the sense that, like, Jesus, he didn't have any women in his group. You know, there were no women disciples. He didn't have any disciples with disabilities, but we knew by his actions and by his words that women mattered. And we knew that lepers mattered because of how Jesus treated people. And so I think that because we do have so many more platforms, you know, Jesus didn't have Twitter, he didn't have Facebook, he didn't have Instagram. But when we have these tools at our disposal, and it's a very simple thing to say, hey, let me type this status and let me share this with the people in we all have our bubbles or echo chambers, right? So let me share this with my audience and let them know that this is something that I believe and that I'm affirming. And not that I'm a perfect person or that I understand everything that, you know, black folks are going through, but at the very least, it's the very least I can do is just acknowledge the humanity of black people, of millions, there's millions of us in this nation. I don't know if you guys noticed, but
we are here.
We're here. And that affirmation means more than you can imagine, especially at such a time as this.
I think that's a great answer. And I want to come back to our conversation a little bit because I found that personally edifying and helpful to me, and I want to talk about how specifically in a moment, but thank you so much for that. Jaleith, I wanted to give you a crack at that too and see if you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really great, concise answer. I'll just elaborate. I do think, you know, leveraging privilege, there are some conversations that people just will not have with me, or some positions people will not respect coming from me because they have an implicit bias against me or what have you because of my skin color. And you know, there are some tables that I'm just not sitting at, right? And so, to your point, yes, you know, leveraging your influence and your spheres of influence to say Black Lives Matter is important. I think the other thing to acknowledge is just that when we said Black Lives Matter, we were met with the response, all lives matter. And I don't want to be, you know, super polarizing or anything like that.
Let's press into that though,
Yeah.
Because hey, if we're not going to talk about it here, where are we going to talk about it? And I don't mean to cut you off.
No, that's great, because I was really just waiting for the green light. But you know,
the light is on. So all lives matter. Why does that trigger, upset, infuriate you when that's the response? And I want to be sensitive because I'm going to take the position that some people are just well-meaning,
sure,
and just don't know why people are upset when that's the response. So because I want to believe the best and I want to have a conversation. And so if that's you, and by the way, let me just say to you, if your response is someone types Black Lives Matter, I want you to think about why your response is all lives matter and why that's important. You just do some self-analysis in this, and now I want to give space for you to hear some responses on what that feels like on the other side, or how it's interpreted on the other side, even if that's not your intention when you're writing that out, which again, I'm going to say with all benefit of the doubt that I choose to believe that. So now with the green light's on, go.
Sure. So, you know, when when people who look like you are being murdered, right, on video, and it's going viral, and this is like not even giving everybody, I know that not everybody even knows the context or like the history of lynching and like how those were public demonstrations to strike fear into black communities and the purposes of those particular heinous acts. But this is kind of modern day version of it, right, where you see somebody that you identify with um, being killed, and then the videos are going viral, the news stories are in the 24-hour news cycle, there's no accountability, no justice. And people are questioning, well, what did they do to deserve that, when the law says that nobody deserves that, right? The law says you are innocent until proven guilty, or at least that you get to go to trial, right? Like, there's some things that are not, I personally don't believe in the death penalty, but even if I did, that is a judgment that is reserved for post court proceedings. And what we're seeing is that people are being killed for minor infractions or even annoyances, or just not that either, like sleeping at their homes. Breonna Taylor was at home and asleep, and so when the response is, well, all lives matter, it's like, but we're talking about the ones that are at jeopardy right now. We're talking about the ones who are not being treated like they matter. When Jesus leaves the 99 for one, nobody is in the church. I've never heard somebody respond to reckless love with, well, no, don't leave the 99. All
99 matter.
All 99
all
matter.
sheep matter.
No one says that, and so it's gut wrenching, because it just doesn't acknowledge the reality that we face, simply because other people don't face it. And it says to me, well, just because you experience that, or maybe you don't even experience, like, it questions whether I even experience some of the things that I do have to navigate on a regular basis. And then I guess the other part of it is that, yeah, like, if all lives matter, why aren't you mad? Like, why aren't you angry at this injustice too? Like, one of the things that I really hope to gain from these kinds of conversations is just the empathy that of decent humans. Like, I just want people to see us as humans and say, oh, that person just got gunned down by the police. That's awful. Every life matters. Yeah, like, I wouldn't be mad if everybody looked at that and said, even this person's life matters. But that's not how that phrase is being used, at least in the conversations that I've been having. When I say Black Lives Matter, it's usually being used to tell me, don't say that, because they're not the only lives that matter. But I just need to make sure that you all understand that when I say that, I'm not saying only Black Lives Matter. I'm saying Black Lives Matter too. Black Lives Matter just as much. Black Lives Matter even if, right? And so I guess just for me personally, that's one of the few reasons it's particularly triggering, because sometimes it makes me wonder, well, okay, well, if that's true, like, be mad too. Like, this is not okay, right?
I think it's particularly perplexing, because in having these conversations in the last few years, people have said, or just trying to draw kind of simple or similar comparisons, it's like, if someone says, okay, it's breast cancer awareness month, there's not someone chanting who's like, all cancers matter. And because there's awareness that this, the particular level of suffering that a woman has to endure with breast cancer feels different, is a different endeavor, is a different journey of pain and trials that she has to endure, that's going to feel different than colon cancer. It might feel different than any other type of cancer. And so raising that particular level of awareness for the specific set of trials or trauma that a person is confronted with, a woman specifically is confronted with breast cancer, does not undermine the pain of having many other cancers, of lung cancer or anything like that. And so I think that that's very true when it comes to Black lives, is that we as Black people in America have a very specific set of trauma and pain and challenges that only we have because of how this nation was set up.
Yeah.
And so we're just saying, hey, our life matters too, Because quite honestly, at the inception of this country, we were not lives, we were property.
Yeah.
And so I think it's so challenging for people to kind of wrap their heads around, because that's not where we began in this country, you know. And so it's challenging, but it's something that, you know, I don't fully understand why someone might feel the need to then shout back all lives matter, because I'm like, yes, I know, mine too, and my life happens to be black, and that's not a choice that I made, that's a choice that God made.
Yeah.
And so how can we be loving in the way that Christ would have us if we're undermining the value of someone's life? I think it was Pastor Darius Daniels who said that racism is both a individual and a social sin that deprives someone of the life that God would want them to have. Like God says he came so we could have life and life to the full. And if you're in some way diminishing the value of someone's life, then that's not being Christ-like, and that's not actually saying, I think Christ would say that Black Lives Matter. I think God would say that Black Lives Matter, you know. And so I would just kind of challenge us to think about, why is there that, for some folks, that reaction to just push back immediately and say, no, all lives matter. It's like, yes, we know this.
Yeah.
And I think those are great responses. And I think, again, I would just say, if anyone is just like struggles with that, wrestle with, again, why, ask yourself why, and say, what is it I'm trying to say? What I just heard from you both is obviously the affirmation of African American lives at a time where we're seeing a lot of difficult murder, false arrests, whatever the case happening, but at the same time there's a lot of, hey, there's the past to deal with too. So that comes up, and simply affirming someone, yes, your life matters, without having to include everyone, is not a bad thing to do. And I think what I would also say, and you guys talk to me about this too, it doesn't mean, because what I'll see sometimes is all lives matter, or a response that, well, what about the police, and then links to the police that have been shot and killed too. Now, I'm also assuming when we say Black Lives Matter, we're not saying that police lives don't matter either, right? Like, I think as humans, we should also grieve men and women in the line of duty that their lives, and it's right, we're not saying that's not true. Would you, and I know we're getting into another dicey subject there, we will come back to that another day, but isn't that true, right? We're not excluding police people, white people,
there are black
brown
police
people,
officers too. No, I'm kidding, but I'm just saying, like,
well,
no,
there
we're
are,
not,
it's a good
but,
number.
Yeah, but I mean, I was just trying to make light of the situation. Just like, yeah, if we're talking about like we're talking about all people, and I think like it's important to understand that we are literally lobbying and advocating for our humanity. You know, it's not that we want special treatment or special privileges or anything like that. We're just saying, like, treat us fairly, treat us the way that you want to be treated. You know, I think, again, it boils down to back down to like human empathy and seeing us as brothers and sisters, you know, in the Lord, you know. And I'm particularly appealing to the church on this, because we are the ones who have no excuse. Like, we are the ones who should be able to see past all of the things that we don't like about a person, you know. Mark Laberton, I was in a devotional one day, and Mark Laberton was like, you know, God is a lover of his enemies. Lord Jesus, if I didn't have to just sit with that for a minute, you know. And we're called to be like him, right? And so we have a higher standard, and we know this, you know. We know that we're called to a higher standard than everybody else who's not a believer. And I put air quotes just in case you don't know what that means, because you're not a Christian, which is totally okay. Like, we can talk later. And so I just think, you know, it's up to us to kind of demonstrate what that really looks like. And this is, you know, something else that Darius, what's his last name? Darius Daniels. I was listening to him on the way over, because he was getting in there. He was like, you know, we can go to church, but we have to, like, at the church, but we have to be the church in the world. And that is really like what we're called to do, right? And so if we're supposed to be salt and light, what are we preserving if we're not preserving like the love of God and how we're supposed to treat one another? So yeah, I'm really appealing to my brothers and sisters in the Lord who see me not just as a black person but also as a sister in the Lord to say yes, like this is something that she's going through. I'm gonna bear this burden with her. I'm gonna, help her and other people like her to navigate this system of racism in America. And it is not just personal, but it's also social. And I think yeah, I guess in short, yes, police also matter, and I love them too. They're humans.
And I think, like, going back to the example I was giving about Jesus not having any women or folks with ability issues within his crew, within as disciples, like, even in the absence of those people, we still knew how Jesus felt about them. We didn't have to question or beg and say, Jesus, are you sure about that woman? Are you sure her life matters? Or that leper, are you sure? We saw by his actions and by his words. And I think that in particular now, even in the absence of a black person in your community or of a black person in your school or your child's school or at your job, there still has to be that acknowledgement and really honoring of a person's humanity, because there are parts of Connecticut where, like, there are not, the communities are not particularly diverse, and that's not anybody's fault. And there's places in America where there are not particularly diverse communities, and that's not anybody's fault. But when there are communities within an hour away from you that are being oppressed, and where this particular type of violence is happening, we have to, and honestly, and this is one of the things also that I think is low-hanging fruit when people say, oh, well, what about gun violence? And it's like, yes, those Black Lives Matter that are being shot and taken by other black people, those Black Lives Matter as well. And I will be first to say that. And so it's not that we're disacknowledging gun violence that happens in communities. We're also, it's a yes and. It's yes, we're including those in saying that as well, because it should not be that there were, I think it was over 100 people were shot over the weekend in Chicago. Like, that should not be. That hurts my heart too.
Right.
But the difference is that when folks who get caught for those shootings, they go to jail generally, and they serve several years. It is very hard, just statistically, for police officers, 1, to have charges brought against them, and then 2, for them to even go to trial, and then 3, for there to be a conviction. And there's just, you can Google it, and I'm not making these things up, but the way that society is structured is that we've seen a number of people killed by police over the years, and the police are able to return to their jobs. Or we also see that some of these police officers have had histories of excessive use of force, be it a chokehold or beating up a person that they have already arrested or what have you, and they're still allowed to keep their job, bring harm, and then it gets to this point where a life is taken. And so those are some of the things, some of the tensions. But no, like, I mean, I have family members who are police officers. I have, like, that's not something, we're not disavowing the lives of police. And that's also like a knee-jerk reaction, is just to say the all lives matter or blue lives matter. And again, Black Lives Matter isn't saying that those things aren't true either. Right. We're just saying, hey, like, these lives in particular, we matter, because it doesn't seem like what society around us is telling us, or what the statistics or the news is telling us, is that they don't. And it's frustrating to feel in a place like, centuries in this country, and we're still trying to convince people of our humanity.
Yeah, and I think about, like the young people who are seeing this too, right? I'm a millennial, but I'm like an older millennial, so I didn't necessarily grow up on social media, but I'm concerned about young people who are growing up very engaged with social media, who see these things and have to beg the same questions and have to wrestle with the same questions that we adults are still trying to navigate ourselves, right? So it's not just an appeal to you guys, but it's also just an affirmation for young people to grow up with a sense of self as well.
I so appreciate your responses, and I think that you guys have articulated well. And again, as we have this, remember, this is a conversation. So if you are dialed into Facebook Live, again, I want to acknowledge you now and say thank you. And if you have a comment or a question, Jaleith is superstar. So she's right double dipping as sort of forum communicator and part of the conversation panel here. So she is super talented, and she could easily respond and bring your questions or comments into the conversation. And that's why I just want to say this. That's why I like this format. Whereas sermons are good for certain things, but conversations are good for other things. And so my role in this is not to come and instruct you. I'm here to facilitate conversation, drawing from the wisdom and the experience of people around me that can bring some of their perspective, some of their history, some of what they've experienced to the table, and I can process and share with you some of the things that I am learning. So first of all, let me apologize in advance. I am sure I'm going to say some things that are ignorant. I don't come to you as the expert. So let me just say that right up front, and I apologize in advance and don't mean to hurt anybody or upset anybody or offend anybody, although I understand some of the topics are difficult. But I'm a fellow learner, and I hope that you're approaching this as a fellow learner, because as Converge, our church is part of a network called Converge, and our big thing is we're better together. And I truly believe that. One of my greatest fears is that these times would divide the body of Christ from one another, and everyone kind of goes, well, I'm going to my corner, I'm going to my corner. And I think that that is just the antithesis of what Christ has called us to. And it's hard work sometimes to figure out how do we navigate this. It's easier sometimes to say, hey, I'm going to go with my tribe, I'm going to go with my group, because I don't have to explain things, I don't have to, people, they just know. So again, I want to just say from this, I come as a learner in a conversation. And back to the conversation that you and I had, Ryan, I will share with you that one of the concerns, when Ryan, you approached me and said, well, is it difficult for you, or why is it difficult to say Black Lives Matter? And my response to you, and that I'll share with everyone, is I have no issue. My response wasn't the all lives matter, because I can easily say the phrase Black Lives Matter without the qualifier of all lives matter or whatever other qualifiers you want to add to it. I guess my issue, and what I found super helpful from you, was one, you shared your pain, you shared some of what you shared here already, but you went into specific depth of what the experience in America, in this country, was for you, and I appreciated that. But also what was super helpful, and for many of you, you probably say, okay, this is basic, I know this, but for some of you, maybe it's helpful for you to realize that for Black Lives Matter, the distinction between the phrase and the organization, and I'll tell you, that was my tripping point. I'll just be straightforward, and this is not to say, this is not a slam of the organization Black Lives Matter, because I think it has done a lot of good things, but I think that there are, with the organization Black Lives Matter, if you look it up, there are some political leanings and ideologies that I don't personally support, and there are some things behind it that I can't get behind, but I have no problem with the phrase, and I have no problem with the affirmation of people. I think it's like basic humanity. And one of the things that was helpful to me is, Ryan, well, let's just say, what was your response when I brought that up to you? I think you were gracious in how you responded, but can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, just really, as I was kind of talking about before, just really underscoring that what Black Lives Matter as its inception was an affirmation of the humanity of Black people. And so before it became politicized or before it developed into an organization, it was just an affirmation. And I think that is what matters. That's what I'm holding dear. That's what I would want to see if I'm at this church. I would want to know that Black Lives Matter at Calvary Fellowship. I would want to know that Black Lives Matter at my job. And so I think that is, I understand where, you did your research. But then,
you told me not everyone does it.
Right. And not everyone looks up, if they go to the website, and maybe not everyone is, aware of their platform and things like that. And that's okay. But again, when I'm concerned, or when I'm frustrated, or when I'm feeling out of breath, or when I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm not thinking about an organization. I'm thinking about my life. I'm thinking about my safety. I'm thinking about if I'm walking down the street, or if I'm even, like going to the post office. I won't say what town it was, but I've got my mask on just like everyone else, and I get a lot of looks, and I just don't, and that is hard for me, because I'm like, I'm just coming to the post office just like you are. Like, everyone's kind of easing their way back into the places and going out and hoping that you're going to come back in good health and everything like that. And so part of it is like just wanting people to understand that our lives do matter. And it's not about, I think the world is, we're human beings, we're smart people. Rhetoric is very powerful. Politics are very powerful. Politics are divisive. And I know that's something that Calvary has made a conscious decision to not even take a step back from, but to really sort of leave out, and intentionally so. And I understand that. But I think that I would just caution people to be mindful of allowing politicization or rhetoric to override not even the consideration, but the acknowledgement of humanity, of Black lives. And so that can be very powerful and pervasive, and has been in a lot of ways, because people will, you might hear, like, if you could list out what are the 10 things that, when you hear Black Lives Matter, what are 10 things that you think of, or what are 5 things that you think of when you hear that phrase, and then look on your paper and see, do any of those deal with affirming humanity? Do any of those address the very real issues that Black people being killed at the hands of police or other American citizens? If that's not what you think of when you hear that phrase, maybe think about, have I allowed other people's thoughts or other people's rhetorics to inform what, again, for me at least, is just an affirmation of my humanity.
I think that's so good, because words matter and words are loaded, and we come to everything, and I say this with a sense, we come with certain prejudices or preloaded training and experiences, and when we interpret a phrase, we're sometimes pulling in the politics that we've heard, that we've read, that we've had reiterated to us. And so I think that is something to consider in this. Jaleith, I want to come back to some of what you said, but any further thoughts on that? Did you want to elaborate on that at all?
I wanted to walk through my analogy, but I don't know if we have time, about how the COVID-19 pandemic is probably the closest thing people can experience, that's parallel to like what we would experience in engaging with law enforcement or just outside.
We'll have time. Can I respond to Ryan first then? Because
Yeah.
I think this will be more direct before we come back to that topic. So your words were super helpful to me. What Ryan explained to me is not only is taking the phrase Black Lives Matter, because one of the things that I asked Ryan was, why this phrase? Like it's what's important to me as a pastor is that every single person of color in our church knows that you matter. So like, for example, one of our core values is unity in diversity. We didn't create the whatever diversity in our church we have, we didn't create. God ordained. And so the two responses I see as a pastor are, number one, to celebrate that. People need to know, and saying Black Lives Matter, right? That's a celebration of a group of people, like whatever person you look like, you matter, you're welcome, you're valuable here, but also to steward that and to have representation for whoever's in the pews. We don't have pews, but whoever's coming in part of our church is also on stage as a leader and represented in various ways in the lifeblood of the church. And that's an important thing. But the phrase for me was, because of that, dicey, and that helped me to say, because I have no problem with the phrase, and that was helpful to me. What you also said is, so there's the national organization of Black Lives Matter, but there's lots of different local charters, and they don't all stand for the same exact, my understanding of the same exact principles as the mothership or the parent organization, and so there's differences and distinctions. And I think that, again, coming to you as someone walking through this process, the value of conversation is developed right there. Because there was a shift in my mind when I kind of began to say, oh, okay, so we can separate the organization and the politics of it, which I can get into just a little bit, but we can save for another time, politics in general, not BLM politics, but there's a distinction between the organization and the phrase and the affirmation that it is important that people hear, your life matters, you matter, you are important, you're equal, you're not less than, you are extremely valuable. And I think that was a helpful thing for me, because I want to have, as Ryan challenged you, if you're thinking through, well, why, if that's a hard thing for you to say, why is that, and what are some of the things that are in there? And for some of you, it's like, oh, but there's some Marxism, or there's some this, and it's like, again, separate the politics from the phrase. And so at this point, thank you. You helped me. Black Lives Matter. I say it right without an asterisk, without the
Without
qualifier or
qualification.
without qualification. Absolutely, that's true. It's what I thought before. It's what I felt before, but I didn't use that phrase. So thank you for helping move again, because I think we had a redemptive conversation and it led to some transformation in my thinking. Now,
I was just gonna say quickly, and in some ways, I think it's not unlike some of the hesitation that we have as Christians, as believers, to say out loud, to really live our faith out loud, is because there's a lot of the politicization of Christianity, or how that's been used on a lot of different stages and platforms for control and manipulation and things like that. Is like, we feel, some folks might feel like, if I say that I love Jesus or I believe in God or I'm a Christian out loud, that might also then lead someone else to believe that I am willing to persecute people because of their sexual identity or their gender identity, or that I don't believe that I'm going to condemn a woman who's had an abortion or anything like that. Like, that again is like, when you look at what Christ was about and where his heart was and what he sought to do and what God sent him for, that is all about love. And that, if we can't say out loud that I love Christ and that his love saved me, because we're afraid of what other people think, that does a disservice to everybody, because it keeps us from helping other people experience Christ's love and us showing Christ's love to them. In the same way that, like, if there's a fear of saying Black Lives Matter on a social platform, or saying it at your dinner table, or saying it on a Zoom call or wherever you are, because you are worried about how other people might think about you, it's really about, again, we serve God. God knows our heart, and that's who we need to be. I think we need to be ultimately concerned about, is not what other people think, but about this willingness. And Jesus specialized in being uncomfortable. And I think that is an invitation in this moment. If you have not said Black Lives Matter, or considered what it might mean for you to say that in the midst of your discomfort, then think about, again, what that can do for your Black coworkers or your Black friends, or your children who have Black friends, or teachers, or whomever, or people who help serve in some way. There's Black people, we're everywhere. We're picking up your trash. We're at the drive-through window. We're at your doctor's office, wherever. And so just think about, like, those type of things. About, I get the discomfort, and it is it's challenging to be a Christian. It's challenging to love God out loud and make sure that it's in the same way. It's like, you can't look at a Christian and see, or you can't look at a person and see that we don't have markers. We're not covering in any way, or we don't have to have different, like, sort of visible religious services, but in the ways that I'm thinking about in terms of Islam and Judaism. But when you look at us, when you look at me, I hope you can see God's love. I hope that you can see that compassion. I hope you can see the joy that I have in salvation. And in the same way that when you look at me, I hope you can see, wow, that's a beautiful Black life, and her life matters, or we wouldn't know, unfortunately, in this country. You don't know I wouldn't know if you valued my life or if you value Black life unless you said it.
Yeah. And
I know that now, and I had an idea before because I decided to join the church, but unfortunately it's at least for me, I think it's a thing for non-Black people. It can't necessarily go without saying. You can't necessarily assume that someone is going to trust that you value their life unless it's said out loud.
That's well said, I think, and super helpful, and I appreciate that. And I'm glad that I believe your life matters, because you do, and you do, and so do you. And I appreciate, again, everybody that's checking this out and participating in this. And I love your point, how you paralleled that if you publicly say Black Lives Matter, there might be some baggage associated with that. In the same way, Christianity, if you say, I'm afraid to say I'm Christian because there's baggage. And I will say that was the motivator, because I'm glad you made the distinction. We didn't decide as a church to pull out of politics. We decided when we started we weren't going to enter that business. There's a lot of people doing it. A lot of people doing it better and so forth. And by the way, I have zero issue if you're part of the church. You should be engaged in politics. You should find who you're voting for, why you're voting for, and maybe you're a politician and you should do your job, or connected to politicians, whatever the case. So we're not anti-politics as people. Politics matter, and they put people in charge that make decisions. All that matters. All I'm saying as a church, that our conviction, and when we started, was that the gospel is the most important thing in the world. That's my belief, that what Jesus lived and embodies and messages, that's what we want to do. I also knew that politics are dicey and thorny, and sometimes some of the causes that I would want to represent, the politics would go in support that, some kinds against that. But what I just said is, as a church, I believe if we put that aside and focus on Jesus first, we can love each other. And I'd rather see a room full of Republicans, Democrats, Independents, all across the political aisle than one or the other. That just because we want to keep our politics higher. Now, what I also said to you is that I know that saying that we're apolitical as a church is not a shield to diffuse us and prevent us from having to deal with thorny issues. I think our job as Christians is to take these thorny issues that are entangled in politics and do the hard work and disentangle them, look through the redemptive lens of the gospel, recognize that politics may have a work. We're not going to be politically driven or so forth, but that doesn't give us an excuse not to talk about things that have either been co-opted by politics or by nature are enmeshed and dealt with them. So that's a little bit, we could deal with more of that the other day, but I think it's important that there's some level of understanding of that. So, any questions?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, let me shut up.
No, you're good. You're good. So Murray says, I commend you both for being so vulnerable. Something that I struggle with is not knowing what to say or even how to start a conversation on understanding privilege. I'm open to hearing your suggestions. So, yeah, not knowing what to say or even how to start the conversation. I guess I like to start conversations with questions, personally. They allow people to have a sense of freedom, obviously, because it's open-ended, but also they force you into a level of humility because you're taking a learning posture. And so, a question I would ask, if I were a person of privilege trying to help other people of privilege understand what's going on, is just ask, like, what do you think about all of, the things that you're seeing about Black Lives Matter? Or if you don't want to go so pointed, maybe, you could say police brutality, or just like race relations in America, or just, some of the societal ills that we're experiencing. You can go as deep or as light as you want to go on it. But I tend to start conversations with questions, or if I have something really interesting, to share. You know what I observed? Oh, you know what I saw in the store the other day? Oh my goodness, why do you think that happened? And just kind of see where they're at. I don't know if you're still watching, if you can maybe provide some context for, the kinds of conversations that you're talking about, like who you may want to be talking to. That would be helpful for me personally. I don't know if either of you have other thoughts.
I think now more than ever is a beautiful time to learn. There's so many books out there available. I think so much so that book sellers, independent and large ones, are having a hard time keeping up with the demand for a lot of books dealing with privilege, dealing with racism, anti-racism. And so I would encourage you to just find a book that deals with privilege and talks about that. And then also understand that, like, having privilege also is not a condemnation. Again, God chooses the race that we are, chooses our skin color. And so, but just understanding that, like, let's just say, as a white person, that privilege that you have, it's almost like an invisible card that you carry, but it means that you are probably less likely to not get followed in a store when you enter. You might have, get a better interest rate when it comes to taking out a mortgage for a house or a car. You likely are there's just a lot of things afforded to you if you happen to be a white person that are not afforded to Black people. And that's not something, again, you did not choose that privilege. It was afforded to you when you came into the world. And so I think that also when it comes to sometimes with privilege, there comes guilt. And the thing I want to say about guilt is that guilt doesn't protect anybody. Guilt doesn't keep me safe, and that is something that I think that in some ways, if you do have privilege and you're feeling guilty about that privilege, take time to grieve your guilt and then get active.
Yeah.
Start reading a book. Start having conversations that feel uncomfortable. Start asking questions or saying the things out loud, even if you're just writing it down to yourself, that make you feel uncomfortable. And then once you can move, I think being in a place of productive discomfort is really important, because we have to be able to understand. My friend and I were talking the other day about how cancel culture does not have space for grace. And that's not where we need to be. I think being able to come to each other and say, hey, I was feeling this and I'm not proud that I felt that, but I want to bring this to you, and can we talk about it? Because I want to understand, or I just want to confess this. And not condemning a person for thinking or feeling a particular way, but saying, okay, and offering up grace and offering up compassion, and then saying, okay, now what are we going to do? How can we move past this? Or how can we take your lesson and use that as a springboard or a catalyst to help other people work through some things that I think we all have said things or done things that we're not proud of. But I think that that's what grace is about, and that's what mercy is about. And so as we're learning to be better people, as we're learning to be more accepting and more loving of all people, and more aware of the struggles that Black people in America in particular have, like, I think that just comes with the desire to learn, and commit to learning and commit to asking questions, and then understand, like, God will help you through that growth as well. I don't think he ever leaves us to grow by ourselves.
Amen. A lot of what you said in there I love, and one of the things is the idea of cancel culture, and I think that and I had a similar conversation that there's no grace in it. It's like this attack, and then you're labeled, branded, and canceled, and that's the antithesis of Jesus. The great thing about Jesus is he might label you sinner and right, and he might judge, but he gives you his grace to change. He gives you grace for transformation. And I'll just say, as a white person, and if you're watching this, I will say I know a lot of white people who just have tuned out because they're afraid of cancel culture. And if I say the wrong thing, if I step in the wrong pile, all of a sudden I'm going to get canceled, judged. And you know what? You're not wrong. In some cases that could happen, and we need to be careful. But I think for all of us tapping into, as Christians, that grace and not being so quick to cancel culture. It doesn't mean we don't call out, right? Because sin gets called out, but we also restore. So it's not just the pointing finger of accusation, but it's also the hand of, hey, let's pull you back in, and how do we grow with this together? And Jesus, as we talked about earlier, did that with his enemies, and for us to do that with people that hurt us with their words, that even out of ignorance say things that are hurtful. That's a good point. So I wanted to say and that could be a whole different maybe conversation too. But the idea of with privilege, I also like that you said it's not a condemnation, because I think sometimes when people feel defensive, they want to kind of push back. And I know when I was first hearing the terms white privilege, it's, and I get it, like that's a form. It's not the only form of privilege. There are privileges of class. There are privileges of certain education and experiences and neighborhoods and all kinds of things. Privilege can be big things like that. It can be like some of you guys have tall privilege. As a short guy, I might need your help to reach that top shelf, and that's a small example of. And I know I'm not trying to lampoon it, but the idea of privilege is using something you have to benefit that someone that doesn't. So that's kind of how I make that example. And I think the worst thing we could do, as we learned last week, is try to replace the word with something more palatable that'll get you in a lot of trouble and international media attention. Let's not go there today.
Yeah, no. But I do want to make a comment on cancel culture. This is part of why I keep advocating for people to just be in relationship and in community with people who are different from them. Because when you test the waters in a relationship that has margin, because you trust each other already and you know the other person doesn't mean harm towards you, then there's room for mistakes. Now, don't overdo it. Don't overdo it. Don't try to make all your mistakes in one instance, because that can be really overwhelming and hurtful for the other person. But ask the questions that you need to ask to the people you trust. They will understand, and be mindful of when you do that, right? Like, if it's a high stress time, say, I don't know, pandemic, maybe don't do it immediately then. And if it's also at the very beginning of your relationship with this person, don't do it then either, because then it feels very tokenizing and very much like you're only in the relationship to be able to ask me these kinds of questions. Make sure your relationship has other dimensions and facets to it, and that this is somebody that you would be in relationship with even if they didn't look different from you or didn't have a different whatever the distinction is from you, because that's where you are able to build authentic bonds with one another and authentic relationships, and ultimately grow to love one another like Christ calls you. I'm not saying to fall in love. This is not what I'm saying. Do not go on racial reconciliation dating. But
I haven't heard that one. I guess humans find a way to mess everything up.
we
Pretty
out
much.
here just but my point just is
Oh,
to
boy.
just spend time getting to know people, and then you'll be able to have safe relationships to ask tough questions.
And the thing about it is, like, I think about, okay, let's just say on a whim that Jesus was black. And Paul was not. And Paul was like, and Jesus was like, listen, I know you're going to say all lives matter 3 times. I know it. I said, we're boys, but I seen you at the protest. You got with those people, and all of a sudden, all lives matter comes out. And Paul's like, nah, Jesus, I'm down. Black lives matter. Everything's cool. And then it happens. And Jesus is like, oh, he's hurt. He's disappointed. But at the same time, he's like, hey, you're human. And you were in a position where the majority of what people were saying wasn't what. They didn't look like me. They didn't sound like me. They hadn't walked the way I walked. They haven't been through what I've been through. They didn't come from Nazareth, okay? They're from different places. And so they have a different lived experience. And all of us have different lived experiences. But because of grace, Jesus said, okay, I forgive you. And if Paul had sat in his guilt, dare I say white guilt, then he wouldn't have gone on to plant as many churches and bring the gospel across the world, really, in the way that he did if he sat in that guilt. And also, if also Jesus had condemned him as well. And so that's why it's important for us to remember on both sides of the equation that there must be grace and there cannot be condemnation, because guilt and condemnation are counterproductive to compassion. And I think that's what we have to have for each other in this time is compassion. Like I think I shared it with you, but I lived in North Carolina for 3rd and 4th grade, and I had a friend. She was my white friend, and we were cool. And then we moved back to the DC area, but when Facebook came about, we found each other on Facebook. So we really haven't had any conversations, but I saw a few weeks ago that she posted Black Lives Matter. And I thought about that. I was like, wow, like that means something to me, even though we haven't had a conversation in years, because I was her black friend when we were in 3rd and 4th grade. And she is a teacher now in North Carolina and has black students. And what she said was that, but she, posted a picture in the statement as well. And then went on to say that, I've been too cowardly to say this in the past, and kind of explained why she had not been able to say that publicly. And I appreciated that. And I think what that also does, and what it can do for many other people, is model, right? We have to have a little humility. Is like, without Jesus, we're lost. When we find Jesus, we're found. We come into a new learning. We have a new understanding, not even just of the world, but a new understanding of ourselves. Because sometimes we deal with ourselves without compassion. We deal with ourselves without empathy, or we can be very callous towards each other, or judgmental or critical of ourselves. And so once we find Jesus, the light turns on in the whole house. And so the illumination of what it means to be in darkness when it comes to, I think a lot of folks unfortunately are in darkness when it comes to the real ills of racism. But when you turn the light on, the Black Lives Matter light on, you cut it on, I guarantee you the whole house will be illuminated, because you're going to be able to see not only our humanity, but also see our pain in a different way. And I think it's so important to see that, because that's just like the reality of where we are today. But that, to me, her saying that meant something to me, and we haven't had a conversation. But it also, again, modeled to her network, her echo chamber and her bubble, that, hey, like, I'm having the courage to say that. So maybe by her doing that, she's then is encouraging other people to do that as well, to take that kind of step into productive discomfort. So
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So we are out of time, but as always, we like to wrap up our discussion with something that's redemptive and maybe a thought, even like so, maybe 1 minute or less We'll let you
Why do you
ladies
look at me like
go
that?
first because it's your turn.
Oh.
Like what would you say is the next step from today's conversation? Either something that comes to mind or a recommendation. Um, we know not what is it racial reconciliation dating is that
No.
no don't do that. So but what would be a positive? Sorry, that was going to stick with me. What would be a positive? And by the way, we have no issue at
None.
all with people dating, married, different ethnicities. Love the blended families in our church of different ethnicities. Love all of that. So let's be clear.
Yes, please, thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay.
So I have a couple. One would be to, examine your circles. If your circles look like you and only like you and behave only like you and have people who only do what you do, then you need to think about why that is and see if there are any ways that you can change that. I know that we're social distancing, and so that might be a little difficult, but maybe just examine some of your thoughts and actions and behaviors that have led to that outcome, and ask yourself some questions about that. The other thing I would say is to really kind of live fully in the knowledge that you were created to exist in such a time as this. And so this is not, just chance that you're alive right now when this is happening. And I know it's very easy to think about things that have happened in the past, and I remember like reading about certain things in my textbooks and being like, if I was there, then I would have done that. Ooh, and all of this, I would have been sitting right next to her on the bus. Really challenge yourself to think about what you're doing now in the middle of history, right? And is that really what you want to be doing or where you want to be when it's all said and done? You weren't here by accident, regardless of how you entered this world. God didn't put you here by accident in this place and time and space with these people. So, you have a purpose, and you can examine your own life and your own circles and experiences to understand, how you can leverage your circles and your voice in those circles. Sorry, I'm trying to like project and calm down.
you Jaleith, you did great. Ryan?
Yes, I would encourage you all. There's a sermon that deals with racial reconciliation. A couple of them on Transformation Church. They're on YouTube. So there's a couple sermons, and there's the other one that we've been referencing with Dr. Darius Daniels that we talked about. So there's a couple links that hopefully you can share in the chat afterwards. And then also I just would really encourage you all to ask God to create empathy and compassion within your hearts. One of the hard things that I've heard from my family, from my father specifically, in the last few weeks was like, my father is 67 years old, and he said, I really didn't think that your brother and I would have to see Black people dying in the streets in the way that they are. And I think that's painful, and that was painful to hear from him. And we're hurting. Black people, we are hurting. And certainly there's been plenty of conversations about how that pain is being expressed, but at the end of the day, the pain is something that is very real, and feels overwhelming at times. And part of that, those feelings of being overwhelmed come from not knowing when it's going to end, not knowing what the immediate solutions are, and so that can feel really scary a lot of days. And so I would just encourage you all to just try and understand how much pain Black people are in, and how much pain we've been in, and it's not something that we've to grow up living in fear of your life or in fear of your brother's life or all of those things. That's a really hard pain to live with continually, and a fear to live with. And so I would just encourage you all to try and understand where we're at and how we might be feeling, and just ask God again for that empathy and for that compassion, and also for courage. I think I said to you, we need you. Like, we need white people. We need everybody in this fight, and we need everybody in this. I think I think we have to fight for love. Like love is an action, and I think that we literally need everybody. And I'm not the type of person. I'm not the black person that's gonna say, well, where have you been? If you here, board the train and let's ride. Like don't get off, because we really need everybody as much as possible in this fight against racism, and that is a huge evil. I'd say that we gotta work against.
Amen. I appreciate both of those sort of wrap up thoughts and applications. And I guess to two things that I would add. Number one, the first thing I would say is when it comes to this, think of this idea of the phrase Black Lives Matter and practically work out whatever barriers you. And if you're African American, you're like, okay, why are we even having this conversation? I hope for you maybe hearing some of the reason and hesitation has been helpful to you. If not, then tune that part out. I'm sure there was other good stuff for you. But for my white friends that may have trouble and challenge with that, think about separating the politics, the baggage, and all of that with the simple affirmation. There are people literally asking, do I matter to you? Mm-hmm. And as a human and as a Jesus follower, they need to hear yes unequivocally, mm-hmm. You matter. You're equal, you're important, you're here with a purpose, I love you, right? That as a Christian, nothing else should be said. Even if someone was actively working against us, which is not the case, but the point is that's that. Let's press into that and hear what our brothers and sisters are saying. Number two is it's this sort of idea of working against racism. I want to borrow a phrase from my friend and author, pastor, Dr. David Anderson. He's the one where we say, comprehension begins with conversation, but his book is called Gracism. So I want to say today, be a gracist. As you're going to be anti-racist, we need to bring that grace in. That was a point that came up today when talking about cancel culture and other things. Even the grace to say, I'm not going to be one of those people, well, where were you? Mm-hmm. You're tardy to this whole situation. It's like, hey, where are you right now? There's grace for your past. Mm-hmm. But also grace in Jesus has never been just about forgiving you and keeping you stuck in a pattern. Grace is not just a cushion you fall right. back on. It's a spring to push you forward. Right. And I think that's what I want to hear today say is as we're gracists, it's not about where you've been, but it's what do we do now and again, back to what you said, in the time and day in which we live. So mm-hmm. Ryan, thank you so much. Jaleith, thank you so much. I feel like I have personally learned and benefited from you, and I hope that if you're watching today, you've benefited too, and if it has been challenging or encouraging you, hit the share button, keep the conversation going, and I hope what we're modeling is we can talk about some difficult stuff and still have a productive, loving, gracious conversation. So God bless you guys. We'll hopefully see you next week.